Continuing with getting perspectives from policy and practice, the next two speakers are really great examples of people who have done some wonderful work in the field. Up first with some reactions will be Terry Siskin, who's the Deputy Superintendent for Accountability in the South Carolina Department of Education, and she comes to us with a wide experience in every aspect of assessment and research within the State Department, as well as experience in district, working at the district level, as well as an experienced teacher. And she will be followed by Margaret Peg Cagle, who's a real honest-to-God teacher. Yay! Not only an honest-to-God teacher from Los Angeles Unified School District, a teacher of mathematics in middle school, so she's my real hero, teaching middle school kids. She's not only a national board certified teacher, but she's been honored as Teacher of the Year in LAUSD and on U.S. News and World Report's Best Teacher team. And has wide experience in collaborating with institutions of higher education and to particularly work on professional development and teacher development. So lots of experience coming to us. And I learned in the cab on the way over here, a former architect. So a very interesting woman. So anyways, we're going to start with Terry, and then we're going to move to Peg. So I'm going to invite Terry up here.
I told Margaret yesterday that I think I'm at that period of cognitive dissonance where I can't quite figure out what the answer is, and seems to be a protracted period. So I'm going to limit my comments, at least initially, to lessons learned in South Carolina. I think it's some of the work we've done and some of our grants that brought the attention of this group to us. So I'm going to give those lessons learned, and then if I have time at the end, I'll comment on some of the disparate thoughts that I have. Most of these lessons learned have to do with grants or programs or pilots that are not specifically or necessarily related to our summative assessment. And we have a teacher quality research grant funded through IES. We're in our last stages of that grant that built upon earlier work that we had done with assessment literacy, wherein we built a professional development curriculum. And during the course of this grant, we did find that implementation of that curriculum and those modules did improve teacher knowledge of classroom assessment skills. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In the first phase, we had trained assessment coaches, and we had personalized feedback for teachers, but we found that in the second year when we phased that out and we had facilitators, relatively untrained facilitators with the same curricular materials, we had the same results. So from a policy standpoint, since resources are scarce, this does not bode well for implementing this assessment coach model. And most recently, we've analyzed our results, and we found, and this is similar to the work that Margaret reported on, that even though we've seen enhancements in a number of these areas in terms of teacher knowledge, that does not necessarily equate to change in practice, and certainly didn't equate, in our case, to improved student achievement. And so I borrowed from Joan yesterday this diagram because I think we found, yes, it's true that the teachers didn't understand the standards, and I don't know that that's their fault at all. It may be the way that our standards were written. They were not clear about the cognitive complexity, but we could work through that with the curriculum, and they became more familiar. They certainly enhanced their assessment task ability in terms of developing tasks and even interpreting the results of scores, including the summative assessments. But it's in that use part, that implementation part. It did not come back to practice in the way that it would enhance student achievement. So that's one study. We also had a small PASS science pilot. Now, our current test is, summative test is called PASS. This predates PASS. This is the West Ed PASS, wherein we ran a small pilot, and these West Ed tasks are highly engaging student tasks. They're hands-on tasks. We took out the multiple choice. In the traditional PASS assessments, there's a multiple choice component, and then there's an experimentation component. We took out the multiple choice. We focused on the hands-on experimentation. We tailored it to South Carolina standards, and we did have teachers respond very positively, and students, to these high-quality, engaging, hands-on tasks that were linked to the standards and that were not too time-consuming. We got it down to probably about 90 minutes. We also found that teachers were willing to come in and score, and as long as those rubrics were fairly straightforward, basically checklists, they could do that scoring. And that scoring was beneficial to the teachers not only in terms of being familiar with student work, but also in imparting the science concepts behind the student work to the teachers and to relaying the standards to them. So in a way, it was that professional development was equally as important to us. We also found that when we didn't have any more funding and we couldn't find tasks that met our standards, that teachers were willing to come in and help us develop these kinds of tasks, and that they could do that. It wasn't so easy, but it was not undoable, so that teachers themselves could develop for our use on a larger scale basis these engaging hands-on tasks that were related to our standards. Now, this was a small pilot. We did run the analysis, and once again, we didn't see any change or enhancement in student performance, but there were a lot of limitations in this particular study. Something that we implemented in the past few years is something we call the Algebra Project. This is kind of a joint project between the Dana Center, Agile Minds, and South Carolina. And this is a very intensive, when I say year-long, it's really 3 years long, classroom-embedded training within the content area. And we don't have, this is again anecdotal. It appears that this is beneficial, but it is incremental and, as I phrased it here, tortoise-paced. In other words, we can only work with a limited number of teachers each year. They come in during the summer. We visit with them throughout the school year. We've implemented this through our math and science coach system. It is time-consuming for them. We've had positive responses from the people who've attended, but it is a time-consuming process, and it does take a number of years for them to feel comfortable with all the components. When I was thinking about this project in particular, I was thinking about a project that I worked on when I was at the Citadel. And I was in a teacher training program, and I had a grant to work on training middle school educators. And I guarantee you that nobody in this room, even the people who've known me forever, know anything about this project. It never received any publicity. We have a book. Nobody ever read the book. But I can definitely guarantee that. But what we did is we took 6 teacher students who were training to be teachers, and we took a cohort of middle school teachers, and we designed the program so that we had case-based studies that we used in our training program. The teachers from the schools were the co-teachers. We did simulations in classes. The teachers who were student teaching did their practica experiences and their student teaching experiences in these schools, so they felt supported. Everybody wrote cases, and we talked about them. And I feel very proud of that, because I think that those teachers that went out after that project really were well trained to teach in middle school. One of them went to Wisconsin and one of them went to Colorado, so you are benefiting from that as well. But when I think about that from the standpoint that I was proud of that, I think of that as a ripple effect. Look at all, there were only 6 teachers, but look at all the students they've touched over these years. But on the other hand, when you think about that, and you think about that in terms of something like this algebra project, you've got those little ripples in this vast, vast ocean. And there are so few teachers that you can reach at a time with this kind of thing that it is a positive experience, but it is a slow process as well. We do need to build data systems to better evaluate the effects of these programs, and we're trying to do that. We need to look at teacher performance measures. We need to look at the fidelity of implementation. We need to see whether these results are sustained. We need to look at student performance. We are trying to build in components in our data system where we can identify which students have been exposed to teachers or to particular types of projects similar to this one. By the way, we've lost the funding for all of these things, so that we hope to be able to continue on with this one and the next one, Keeping Learning on Track, which was based on the Black and Willem research working with ETS. It was like the algebra project. It was intensive. It was incremental. We do need a way to identify those programs so that we can look at the results. It is promising, and it has been promising, but there's no money to continue. We did develop some modules in this project, and those are available for use. And we have heard from a few schools where they have really bought into this process, and they've seen the results at their schools, and so they will continue to use that. We have a statewide adoption list for formative assessments, so just ignore the word formative for a minute. But this is one of those instances where we can make lemonade out of lemons. We went to the General Assembly, and we went to task forces with the idea of this comprehensive assessment system, similar to what we've talked about. This was about 3 years ago, and even though we had some comprehension of formative assessment in a way similar to what Roy Romer, the example he gave us with the pilots yesterday, in South Carolina, we had some legislators who were talking about textile mills, and you don't want to wait till the end of the process to see, if your textile meets the standard and that kind of thing. When it came out in the General Assembly, when the legislation came out, it didn't look like that comprehensive assessment program that we had initially envisioned. In addition, we had these task forces, and we talked with teachers and educators in our districts, and they did not want us at the state level to dictate especially that interim piece. They wanted to select their own interim assessments. For one reason, they didn't want us to have the data, which I think is probably a good reason, and for another reason, they were already using things that they felt comfortable with. So what came out of this was an adoption list for formative assessments. And what we've done is we've sort of changed our vernacular to be formative classroom assessments and formative interim assessments so that we can accommodate something like Keep Learning on Track, a system of professional development for teachers, or we can accommodate something more traditional like an interim or benchmark assessment. We did find that there are quasi-experimental studies to support the use of these kinds of systems, not very many, but some of them, that publishers are interested in submitting or developers are interested in submitting to this kind of list. And this applies to many things, but some things that are lovingly embraced when they are voluntary turn evil when they're mandated. And we've had these experiences before. One of the first ones I can remember is work sampling. A number of years ago in South Carolina, work sampling was embraced wholeheartedly by groups of teachers. A few years later, that became the basis for our readiness assessment system. And therefore, it was mandatory. So what was embraced so heartily early on became something that was detested by many, and because of the accountability pressures that were actually perceived, since it was not part of the accountability program, the results were no longer, I don't know how familiar you are with work sampling, but you observe the students throughout the school year. Suddenly we had students in our lowest performing districts who were meeting all of the standards all through the year. So something that was very useful in a formative sense when it was voluntary, clearly when the high stakes pressures, perceived or real, were put to the system, thwarted the value of that. We recently had an enhanced assessment grant where we developed some innovative computer-based science tasks, and very quickly, I'm sure you're aware of this, the tasks are very expensive to develop. We were sort of judging this on implementation, not necessarily on the results for students. Few contractors have the expertise to develop such tasks. Ideally, the tasks are enhanced by the media, but sometimes the medium or media enhancements are actually impediments. In South Carolina, it's very clearly a problem of computer infrastructure, and bandwidth could be a problem. Similarly, we had reporting pilots where we built a report for our exit exam, the math exit exam, so that students who did not pass the exit exam were actually given a report that gave them the building blocks of what they needed to work on, a time frame for when they might want to think about moving toward those skills before they retook the exam again. And we didn't see any improvements. Again, there are a number of considerations here. We probably didn't do a very good job with training or implementing that at all, but we didn't see the outcome that we would have liked to have seen. Similarly, coaching, which plays a big role in South Carolina, is like formative assessments and some of the other things that we've mentioned. It has no universal definition even in South Carolina. We are moving toward implementation rubrics in that. I was going to show you a few examples, but you can go to our website to see that in terms of the kinds of resource. Well, I will show you real quickly. We do have standard support documents. We do have curricular materials as well, but I think this comes the closest to the kinds of things that we were talking about, in that it gives you all of this knowledge, background information, including these instructional guidelines, things that are essential for students to know, misconceptions, sort of a continuum of knowledge where it's not exactly a learning progression, but it's in that realm, and then assessment guidelines. I'll only leave you with one thought from my disparate thoughts, and that is that I started to entitle this presentation, "Can a System Be Coherent If You Don't Know It's Coherent?" And maybe we can come back to that. I don't know. I'm not sure I can even see. Okay. There we go.
And like the other Margaret, I'm also a Mac person, so give me a moment. Fantastic. So as Joan told you, I am indeed a classroom teacher. I'm looking at the time and thinking my first period algebra class is getting ready to do our district assessment, so that's where they're at. In addition to bringing the teacher voice, I should tell you why my voice in particular. I am a member of something called the California Teacher Advisory Council, which is based upon something called the National Teacher Advisory Council, which is a body of the National Academy of Sciences, the goal being particular to STEM, but to bring what they refer to as the wisdom of practice in the form of teacher voice to the work that policy does, to the work that business is engaged with as they look at education. And my take on that is to hopefully start to cause a very small shift, a shift involving only 4 prepositions, so that people other than classroom teachers who are engaged in the work of education start to think of their work rather than being work about us and being done to us, as opposed to that, to start to think of their work as being for us and being done with us. So that's where I'm coming from. Welcome to my world. A good assessment system would buttress and not batter classroom teachers. Better tests are necessary but not sufficient. I think Joan started us out with this comment yesterday. The most visionary design, and sitting here yesterday and today, I'm really seriously blown away by how visionary some of the items and some of the approaches that I'm hearing about really could potentially be. But the most visionary design coupled with myopic implementation is not going to move us in the direction that we want. It's not going to move our kids forward in terms of their learning, because it's not going to move teachers forward in terms of their teaching. And what I mean by myopic implementation, right now, and certainly within California, the state assessment system is really just a nice way of saying the sword of Damocles hanging over the head of every classroom teacher. I think Mark Tucker touched on this yesterday. They're high stakes. And in other countries, they're high stakes for students, but in this country, it's high stakes for teachers. It shouldn't be part of my role as a classroom teacher to motivate students to think that the test matters, especially when they say, well, why does it matter? And the best answer that anybody can say is, well, don't you want our school to look good when it shows up in the LA Times? It shouldn't fall to teachers to, offer to eat worms or for the principal to shave his head for kids to care about the testing. And yet we see this all the time. That's how you get kids to think that it matters how they do on the testing. And that shouldn't be why the kids care about the testing. It should mean more than that. The other thing I want to point out here is that assessment and accountability should not be synonymous, because they truly aren't. Until our assessment systems do more than bully and vilify teachers, they're not really serving the needs of teachers. They're not really serving the needs of students. Having a demoralized teaching force is not in anyone's best interest, especially not the kids that they're supposed to be serving. And any assessment for which the best way to prepare is something other than really solid learning of the content intended to be assessed is somehow an inferior instrument. Look at the work that David Foster is doing with the Silicon Valley Math Initiative of comparing our state standardized testing and some really interesting open response items, not even really rich task items, but still ramping up and really looking at student thinking, and look at what we refer to as the false positives that they're getting off of the state testing, because kids are being taught how to game the system. And if there's anything this generation is really heavily invested in, meaning the generation I work with, it's how to game the system. They love that concept and they embrace it heartily. And so a lot of what we're seeing on state testing really isn't a measure of what they know. It's what they've learned to show. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. I have a few extra thoughts that came to me from yesterday, so if I refer more to my notes, you'll hopefully forgive me. I couldn't help but be struck yesterday by the overwhelming sense of hopefulness and good feeling in the room about, look at how fabulous all of this is. Well, I think it's really important for everybody to realize that teachers are not there with you. There is more dismay, more disheartenedness among the teaching force, and I'm not just talking at my school site, I'm not talking in California only, I'm talking across the country. Teachers really feel under the gun. And there is no way to do your best work when, as the teachers in Florida are now feeling, you're standing on top of a trapdoor. It just doesn't make sense. So that's something else to keep in mind. And on the issue, I believe it was a gentleman from Illinois that raised the issue of using assessment to judge teacher quality. I am a big believer in making sure that teachers that are in the classroom are the teachers we want to be in the classroom. I don't think that teaching should be a career version of welfare. It truly shouldn't. If you have no aptitude, if you have no passion, go find something else for which you do. This is not the place where we can afford to have you stay forever. But if we're going to judge teachers, then we need to, first of all, recognize that teaching is intrinsically incredibly complex work. And until we have a sophisticated enough instrument to use to judge the true complexity engaged with teaching, then I think that we're just doing a real mismatch in terms of trying to assess that. work of classroom teaching is, as I said, very complex. The hard part isn't helping kids to make sense of something they've never seen. Because when they don't know it, they understand that they don't know it. And they're more than willing to ask you questions. They're more than willing to say, oh, I don't get it. And I work with 13-year-olds. I'm interrupted constantly. So if you feel free, okay, it's not going to throw me. The hard part, the truly challenging part of teaching, is in sussing out what it is that kids are heavily invested in, which is, to its core, wrong. Because they don't know that they don't know. And until assessments really help us to see where those misconceptions lie, the extent of them, what other beliefs or knowledge is being based upon those misconceptions, it's not truly serving the needs of what a classroom teacher could most benefit from. Distractors don't do it. Especially not when our kids are routinely told, don't leave anything blank. If you don't know, and I'm hearing some little noise in the audience, right? Bubble C. Well, if C is really a distractor that they're choosing because they think it's right, I'm not getting any information aside from this kid bubbled C. So I think we need to be a little bit more sophisticated if we're really looking at how we could be informed. The other thing that I think is really important to touch on is the idea of transparency that Linda brought up this morning. In California, the test arrives wrapped. It comes to my class in a box. I have to sign that I will not look at the test. I don't get the test until literally 5 minutes before I have to start implementing it. I am allowed to see the timeline that I will use to proctor the exam, but I don't ever see the test itself because it comes coded with kids' names. I have exactly the right number of test booklets. Unless I have a large number of absent kids and there's a test booklet sitting around that I might want to peruse, which I have signed I will attest that I will not, I don't know what's in that test booklet. I do see a limited number of release items after the fact. But without the specificity of knowing what kids didn't understand and why I think they didn't understand it, it may have been the vocabulary. It may have been the format in which the prompt was crafted rather than the content itself. The other thing I'd like to talk about here a little bit is this idea of the value-added aspect of teacher scoring. It's been brought up a number of times here in varying contexts. I think it's important to remember that it's not just the fact that, as Joe pointed out yesterday in Washington, when teachers realized, oh, well, we're actually, grading paragraphs, maybe we should teach them to write paragraphs ahead of time so that they know what it looks like. It's the fact that you become so much more sophisticated in looking for evidence of learning. When you talked about, and a variety of people have brought this up, about what's missing out of teacher preparation, formative assessment, absolutely. But I think the real piece of formative assessment that's missing, it's not, whether to use ABC cards or whiteboards or exit tickets or whatever else you might want to think of. It's what do I really want kids to learn, and what evidence am I going to look for that's going to let me know whether or not they've learned it. And being engaged in that hand scoring truly does refine your ability to look for and recognize evidence of learning. The other thing people have told me is that the diminishing return, or the question of diminishing return, of how many times, everybody I know who scored the AP exams goes back as often as they are invited. They see it as rich and worthwhile no matter how many times they've gotten to go. School districts, school administrators can do all the statistical analysis imaginable, parsed along every possible subgroup, significant or not, and what teachers are likely to walk out of that room with, and believe me, I sit through 2 days of this every single year, is an increased knowledge about mean, median, and maybe a little better idea about what it means to, be statistically significantly outside of the norm. Now, as a math teacher who believes in quantitative literacy, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I think this is a really, really inefficient way to do that if that really were our goal. Right now, the data we get in terms of raw scores or bands really doesn't tell us what kids know and are able to do, and it really doesn't illuminate for us what kids don't know and what we need to do about it. And as a teacher, that's the part that really I need to know is, well, what do I need to do about it? Was it a choice that I made of a way I've sequenced something? Was it as simple as the particular numbers that I put into a particular problem that were misleading and laid the foundation for misconceptions within a particular area? And I'm not getting data with sufficient sophistication to let me really respond to that. Einstein had this on the wall of his office at the Institute for Advanced Study. And I think it's an important thing for us to remember. As important as these assessments are, they're not everything that should be going on in our classrooms. They really aren't. A good assessment system would not pretend to be more than it is, nor purport to do more than it really can. We've allowed ourselves, in the names of accountability, to become so focused that we've gotten tunnel vision. And all we're looking at is what we're testing. And I'm going to take a little bit of exception with the idea of a test worth teaching to. I don't think there is such a thing. I truly don't. Good assessments are necessary. They're not sufficient. And if we continue to raise our assessment systems to the point where they are the end-all and be-all of everything that education is supposed to accomplish, what a tragically impoverished view of education, of what public education is supposed to provide for individual students. What a truly sad story it is for our society as a whole, if that's all we really want. Thinking back to what Mark Tucker, I believe it was yesterday, I've now learned, I don't just want 19th century skills. I used to think they were 21st century skills. I want kids to start with critical and creative thinking, but I also hope that they will learn to work collaboratively, to be appropriate risk takers, to have both the capacity and the impetus to be reflective about their own thinking and revise it when necessary. And above all, to develop genuine intellectual curiosity. I want to see a test that really assesses that. And actually, I don't. That was being very facetious there. So based on everything I heard yesterday, and coming back from the fact that I was here in December, I'm actually going to end with a challenge for everyone, including myself in this. And that's for us to walk out of here, to get on the plane or get on the freeway or whatever we're going to do, and genuinely ask ourselves, so what? Great meeting, great information, interesting and provocative informational presentations, but the fact that you were here hopefully is going to make a difference to student learning. What is it that you're going to do when you go back to your day job that's genuinely going to matter? If we've really arrived at a perfect storm for educational assessment, and I'm beginning to think that maybe we truly have, I'd urge each of you to wield whatever power, use whatever influence you have, hopefully for good. I work with gifted kids. Everyone goes, oh, you have the good kids. I said, just because you have a brain doesn't mean you're always using it for good. And I especially want to implore all of you who are going to have a say in what the assessments look like, please, 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 let's write them in pencil, not carve them into granite. If we want our kids to engage in high-level thinking, bold choices, reflection on their own work, and learning from mistakes, how should we ask anything less of ourselves? Thank you.
Well, thank you to our panelists. We now have some time for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please come forward to the microphone. We have our panel here ready and happy to answer questions.
Diana Pullen from Boston College. I'm interested in the notion that many policy folks are now arguing that we should implement turnaround school models. And I've heard more policy people talking recently about something like a British inspectorate system being used in some states here. So the question I have for any of the panelists, particularly someone like Margaret who's had experience with the inspectorate system, is given the ideas that each of you has offered us this morning, what kinds of suggestions might you have about how to think about infusing some of these notions about best teaching practice into these contexts in which there's so much attention being paid to how to intercede in schools in need of, as some people put it, turnaround?
Well, one of the things as an inspector, it was not just about inspecting the quality of learning, teaching and learning. There was also an advisory component to the work as well. And I think that was perceived as interesting. I used to be called an advisor till Margaret Thatcher appeared, and then we were all changed into inspectors. So that somehow that changed the view of the schools going in there. But nonetheless, I think the role was to observe quality or lack thereof, and if there was lack, and the focus was on practice. You know, I come back to what I said earlier. It wasn't how well a program was being implemented. It was how well teachers were meeting the needs of the specific students. And so to be able to provide feedback to the school on a regular basis about the quality of practice and also ways in which the practice could be developed further to ensure increased learning for students, I think was very valuable. I mean, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, but I had it both as a teacher with inspectors coming and inspecting and giving advice. And I also think you build up a cadre of people who really have expertise across so many different schools, across so many different populations, that the value of that expertise is huge. And I don't know that we have that here, the ability to look in rural schools, urban schools, different kinds of classrooms, different classes of students, and to take lessons from that which then can be fed back to the profession in an advisory capacity. I don't know if that answers your question, Diane, but that's certainly my reflection. But I would definitely keep the advice component as a strong one.
I would agree with that. I was thinking back to one of the first years I taught. My principal didn't have time to get in and do supervision, so he asked someone from the Department of Ed to help out. And having someone outside of the school come into my classroom was a very different experience than having my principal come in and do that evaluation. I remember it felt more collegial. This was somebody who had a broader experience. Now flash forward to work that I've been doing in schools. We observed all the teachers in Hawaii really just to get to know the teachers a little bit better. Really, that it was nothing about evaluating their teaching. But I came away from that feeling, teachers started emailing me. They said, well, are you going to give me feedback? And it's like, oh, now I got to write up 50 evaluations. I couldn't even do it when I was a principal. So what I tried to do is give them feedback on the support strategies that I had observed. And then and I might say, I saw something else in another classroom. And then they would email back, could you send me more information? Now I've got 50 pen pals. But I think there's a value in the fact that I knew the content, I had the broader picture, and I was able to have that dialogue with those teachers, and I could probably tell who the stronger or weaker teachers were. But that different role, I think, could be very powerful, to have that outside view and to be able to say, this is how they're doing it in other places. These are things you really ought. I noticed classroom management. This is a wild bunch of middle school kids. You might try something like this. I could say things that probably their principal couldn't say, and it was just between us, so it wasn't part of their evaluation, but I really think there's got to be a way to have that kind of feedback for teachers.
And I would say that I think a piece of that in terms of making it genuinely successful and meaningful is going to be to start to chip away at this notion that teaching is very private. Teachers in this country still defend their classrooms as their turf. and we've really got to get past that because it's not healthy for anybody, especially the classroom teachers themselves. They just don't realize it.
I don't disagree with anything that my colleagues have said, and I'll add one piece to what they've said. I think sometimes if you can reach a core group and they find that valuable, the word will get out. But what we find in our schools that are probably in these categories is that the teachers don't stay. I mean, there's a constant teacher turnaround. More importantly, there's a constant principal turnaround. We've worked on things like providing housing in these areas, providing other incentives for people to come and stay in these areas. But I think there are other forces at work that we need to keep in mind as well.
Can I also add, though, I agree on the external perspective on this. I think it's valuable. But I really think we have to do, and I speak as a former school administrator of actually 3 different schools. I think we have to do a better job with our leadership within the school in terms of providing that inspection and advice component. That we really need to have school leaders who know what effective practice and what good learning looks like and actually know something about how students learn. And, I think we need people in these leadership positions who have experience in the classroom, who prove themselves quality practitioners, who then can be trained in some management, administrative kind of role. But I hope we're not going to leave that conversation because we've talked about, how it can be helpful to teachers. But really, the leadership on the ground has to be helpful to teachers in a way that right now I don't see too many of them being, at least in California. I can speak back with some authority.
No, do you want to say anything?
Are there more questions? We have one more here.
Am I hitting the microphone? Okay. Pardon? Okay. We've acknowledged the importance of thinking about the full range of... Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Phoebe Winter with Pacific Metrics. But we've acknowledged the importance of thinking of the full range of students in our assessment systems. So I was wondering if you could share any really good examples of the ideas of inclusion and accessibility being built in up front in these classroom assessment systems, whatever you want to call them, formative or interim or benchmark, and while we're looking at learning progressions, because we did, again, acknowledge the idea that kids learn differently, and some of that is based on some of their particular characteristics, some, the environment, who knows. So, but that doesn't seem to have been addressed explicitly in a lot of the presentation. So I was hoping you had some good examples to share.
I'll jump in as a start. I think it's important for any task that we ask students to engage with that it's got lots and lots of, not just different levels, but different types of entry points. I teach mathematics. It's where I spend my day. But I find that a lot of kids devalue, especially as they move into more sophisticated mathematics, they devalue some of the strategies that maybe they were willing to employ when they were younger, and they think that they're, I'm a big 13-year-old now, I shouldn't be drawing pictures. But I think that if we encourage kids to use whatever strategies are appropriate as a way of starting. I've always loved Polya for a variety of reasons, but certainly his idea that problem solving is knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. I think that if kids have that sense of that there's a way to get started on a problem, that will get more information out of them about what they truly know, and again, sussing out where those misconceptions lie as well as where those genuine holes exist. But then I also think our tasks really need to have high ceilings. I don't know that we want everybody meeting 90 or 100%. Certainly on a formative piece, I want to know where the ceiling is so that I want to know just how high my really high flyers have gotten so that I'm making sure that they're learning something and that their needs are being met just as well as the kids who, right now in my state, everything is targeted as, because we have a 5-level system, it's all about getting those basic kids across the border. And it really is, it's like that. You feel like you're smuggling them through, getting them across the border. It doesn't matter how you do it. You got to get them across the border into that proficient category because of the implications. So, that's from my perspective.
I'll
I would just make a general comment about the lack of content knowledge of most special education teachers and how they often are excluded from in-service opportunities to learn the content. And just generally, the most successful schools are the ones that in some way engage the special educators with the classroom teachers as co-teachers. I've seen them co-teaching in classrooms very successfully, and I've seen other special educators who are really at a loss. They're trying to support students, but they don't have the tools to do that. So part of that is about collaboration. Part of that is about bringing them into the fold. Just in my work with alternate assessment, my heart goes out to these special educators who are supposed to be teaching content and don't have the bookshelves that I have to know how to teach science and reading and mathematics and writing. I mean, sometimes I just gather up my books and give them out as door prizes because they need these materials, and I think they've been left out of that process within a school. I think any proposals of moving ahead need to include, like, no teachers left behind, all those support staff. They need to have the teachers' manuals if they're supporting the mathematics program. That often doesn't happen in schools.
Was there... Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't have any specific examples to offer Phoebe, but I just completely agree with what Peg has said in terms of assessments that have multiple entry points, that show a range of performance, and particularly this higher level. I mean, you know, that's what I worry about grade level expectations, because you meet a grade level expectation, and then what do? You have enrichment for half a year.
We know what that looks like.
You know what I think about enrichment, Well, to me, enrichment is a management tool. It's busy work. It's let the good kids get on while I help these kids over here. Sorry and all that for those of you. I know some states have enrichment as part of their. I just wish they'd remove it.
This just gives me an opportunity to address one of my disparate concerns, I guess. And it's been alluded to earlier today, but in one of the diagrams that Joan used yesterday, there was a feedback loop back to the area that I would put our learning progressions in. And what I fear a little bit is that our learning progressions become concretized and that we're not implementing that feedback loop and the things that we learn, and that they're not developmental or developed as we develop new knowledge.
I just can't resist adding. Karen asked that ESL teachers get the content resources they need. Mainstream teachers need the knowledge and experience to deal with students with disabilities and English language learners, amongst other special groups. We've done some work at Crest, and in the spirit of accommodations and finding out how teachers use accommodations in their classrooms and the extent to which those match with the assessment accommodations. And guess what? They don't use any accommodations in their classrooms, and they don't scaffold learning, and therefore they don't know how to use the assessment accommodations either. So this just underscoring this is an area that can't get ignored in the next round. There's got to be resources, special resources, special professional development, and as other panelists have said, developing tools and progressions that have multiple entry points.
I think we have time for just one more question. Did I see one over there somewhere? I was going to save it. Well, if there are no more questions, then I'm going to make a transition to the next speaker, and I think she'll come up. Thank you to the panel.